Good day, everyone. In this session, we are going to discuss on how to measure the cost of living in terms of the Consumer Price Index or the CPI and the GDP deflator. When we say cost of living, this refers to the level of prices relating to a range of the everyday items like the goods and services. This also covers the amount that an individual needs to spend in order to sustain its basic expenses, such as expenses related to housing, food, healthcare, transportation, and the like. So first, we're going to start our discussion with the one of the measures of the cost of living, which is the CPI or the Consumer Price Index. So when we say Consumer Price Index or the CPI, this measures the overall level of prices and the overall cost of goods and services bought by a typical consumer. So this involves goods or the cost, this accounts the cost of goods and services of a typical consumer. So it is based on the consumer's basket. So in calculating the CPI, you have to do the following steps. First is you have to find the fixed basket, or you have to fix the basket considering the fixed quantity of goods and services that is usually found in a typical consumer basket. So this baskets includes the quantity for clothing, foods, housing, and other things that the consumer usually consumes. After you fix the basket or you fix the quantity of the basket, next is you have to find the prices of each commodity or goods typically bought by the consumer. And after you already fix the basket and find the prices, you simply compute the basket's cost by simply multiplying the quantity of the fixed basket and the price. So after computing the basket cost for each year, for example, so you choose a base year and then compute the CPI. So in computing the CPI or Consumer Price Index, you just simply use this formula, wherein the CPI is equivalent to the cost of basket of goods and services in the current year divided by the cost of basket of goods and services in the base year. Then you divide the quotient by 100. So after you compute the CPI, when you are going to measure the inflation rate, so you just simply use this formula. In computing the inflation rate or the percentage increase of the price levels of goods and services, you just simply use this formula. So the CPI inflation rate is equivalent to the difference of the CPI between the current year or this year minus the CPI of the last year and divided by the CPI of the last year times 100%. So take note, the inflation rate should be in terms of percentage. While the CPI, it is not in a percentage, but rather than the CPI is an index. To give these steps more clearly, so let's have here an example. So this table shows the prices and quantities consumed in Croptopia country. And the base year here is 2015, and the quantities of goods consumed in 2015 here represents the typical fixed basket for calculation. So the thing that we're going to do here is to compute the CPI for the years 2015, 2016, and 2017. So our first step here is to fix the basket. So based on this given, the base year is 2015 and the quantities of goods consumed in 2015 represents the typical fixed basket. So the quantity of goods in 2015, so we have here, is actually the basis of our fixed basket. So we have here the quantity of wheat, which is 150, and the quantity of corn, which is 200. So we already find the fixed basket. or the fixed quantity of goods that we are going to multiply to the price levels of these goods across the year. So we have already here the prices of the goods here. So we have the price for wheat and the price of corn across years. So first, after you already fix the basket and find the price, so you compute first the cost of basket. So we have here 2015. So this is the cost of basket. So the cost of basket in 2015, so you just simply multiply the price in 2015. So we have here 3 euros times 150. So this is the quantity of wheat, plus we have here the price of corn, which is 2 times 200. So if you're going to use your calculator, so 3 times 150, so that is 450 plus plus 2 times 200. So the 2 times 200 here is 400. So we have now the cost of basket in 2015 is we have 850. So this is the cost of basket in 2015. After that, we compute the cost of basket in 2016. So here we are going to use the 3.50 price as the price of wheat, multiply by the fixed quantity, which is still 150, plus 2.25 times 200. So why we are still multiplying the price of wheat with the with the quantity in 2015? Of course, because on the given, this is our fixed basket. We assume that the quantity in 2015, in terms of wheat and corn, are actually our fixed part of the fixed basket. So that is why we have to multiply the price of the goods for each year to the fixed quantity set by the fixed basket. So here, 3.50 times 150. So we have here 525 plus 2.25 times 200. We have here 450. So adding the two, 525 plus 450. So our cost of basket in 2016 is 975. Now let's compute for the 2017 cost of basket. So here we are going to use 4 euros in terms of the price of wheat and multiply it again with the fixed quantity of wheat, which is 150. Then for the corn, we will be using 2.50 as the price because that's the price in 2017 multiplied by the fixed quantity of corn, which is 200. So 4 times 150, we have here 600 plus 2.50. 2.50 times 200, we have here 500. So this is 500. So for the cost of basket in 2017, so we have here 1,100. So this is now the cost of basket in 2017. So since we already have the cost of basket, the next thing we do is we can now compute the CPI. So the CPI for 2015. So again, in computing the CPI, so you just simply divide the current cost of basket by its base year. So here it is indicated that 2015 is our base year. So we will be using this 850 as the base year's cost of basket. So here, base year cost of basket. So here in 2015, so the current CPI in 2015 is 850. Divided by this, we have 850 times 100. So 850 divided by 850, that is 1 times 100. We have here 1. So there is no unit for the CPI because it's already an index. So this already captured the index. And next, for the CPI in 2016, So we have here the cost of basket in 2016 is 975. So this one divided by 850 times 100. So 850 because this is our base year cost of basket. So 975 divided by 850 times 100. So that is 114.7. So that is our CPI in 2016. Now, for the CPI in 2017, you just simply divide 1,100 by 850. Then times 100. So 1,100 divided by 850 times 100. So we have here 129.4. So this is now our CPI in 2015. Of course, if we use the base year, take note that the CPI is 100. Then in 2016, we have 114.7. And in 2017, we have now 129.4. So from this, we can now compute the CPI inflation rate in terms of this considering this result. So let's proceed to the next slide. Okay. So in computing the CPI inflation rate, of course, we will be using this formula. So the inflation rate here of using CPI is that you have the CPI of the current year, this year, minus the CPI of last year divided by the CPI of last year, times 100 and in percent. So on this case, so if you're going to compute the CPI inflation rate in 2015 to 2016. So the 2016 is our this year. This is our current year. And the 2015 is our last year. So take note, based on our computation, the CPI in 2016 is 114.7, while the CPI in 2015 is 100. And divided by the CPI in 2015, that is 100. So multiply, sorry, so I'm going to fix this one. So multiply by 100%. So we have here 114.7 minus 100 is 14.7 divided by 100. That is 0.147 times 100%. That is 14.7%. So this is our CPI for the period of 2015 to 2016. Now, in terms of the CPI inflation rate for 2016 to 2017. So again, this is our current year, while the 2016 is the last year. So in order to compute this one, so we have here the CPI in 2017, if you still remember, that is 129.4 minus 114.7 divided by 114.7, because this is the CPI last year, which is CPI last year, which is the 2016, times 100 in percent. So 129.4 minus 114.7 is 14.7 divided by 114.7 times 100. So we have here our CPI inflation rate is 12.8%. So I rounded it up into one decimal point. So this is now our CPI inflation rate in 2015 to 2016 and the CPI inflation rate in 2016 to 2017. So the CPI inflation rate measures how the percentage increase of your overall price levels considering the current year and the data of the last year. Okay, so I hope the concept of the CPI and the CPI inflation rate here are clear. So now let's proceed to the other measure, which is the GDP deflator. So GDP stands for the gross domestic product. So here we will be using the concept of in computing the gross domestic product. So when we say GDP deflator, again, the same with the CPI or the consumer price index, this measures the overall level of the prices. And even this measures the current level of prices relative to the level of prices in the base year. So in calculating the GDP deflator, you have to do these following steps. First is to compute the nominal GDP. So when we say nominal GDP, this is the value of your GDP based on the current price. So therefore, the nominal GDP is not yet corrected for inflation. So in computing the nominal GDP, you just simply multiply the price of the current year and the quantity of the current year. So unlike with the CPI, we multiply the price of the current year by the quantity based on the fixed basket. But here in GDP deflator, it accounts the quantity of the current year. So again, if we're going to define the gross domestic product or the GDP, this values the goods and services produced within the country considering the current period of time. So this values the goods and services that are currently produced within the country given the certain period of time. So we consider the current quantity. After you compute the nominal GDP, you simply compute the real GDP. So the real GDP considers the base year price. So that is why, since we are going to consider it with the base year's price, this is already corrected by the inflation. This is already adjusted by the inflation. So we measure the goods here in terms of the output or in terms of the real value of the output. So in computing the real GDP, you just simply multiply the price of the base year by the quantity of the current year. So here, instead of using the current price, we use the base year's price. Now, after you compute the nominal GDP and the real GDP, you can now compute the GDP deflator. You just simply divide the nominal GDP by its real GDP and you multiply it by 100. So after that one, you simply compute the inflation rate. So this is actually number 4 instead of number 5. So I'm going to here. So compute the inflation rate using the GDP deflator by simply getting the difference between the GDP deflator this year and the GDP deflator last year divided by the GDP deflator last year times 100%. Take note, the inflation rate is the percentage increase in the prices of goods and services. Like in measuring the overall level of prices in this situation, we use the GDP deflator. So let's proceed now with the example. So here we have the same example, but we are going to compute the cost of living based on the GDP deflator. So the first step that we are going to use is to compute the nominal GDP. So we have here the nominal GDP. So we have the year of 2015. So the current price of wheat in 2015 is 3 times the quantity here, that is 150, plus 2 times 200. So 3 times 150, 3 times 150, that is 450, plus 2 times 200, that is 400. So your nominal GDP here is 850. And for 2016, you have here 3.50 times 140. So 3.50 times 140, that is 490, plus 2.25 times 210. So you're going to multiply to add the product of this two goods. So 210. So we have here 962.5. So again, 3.50 times 140, then plus 2.25 times 210. So you have here 962.5. Now for 2017, so you will be using the current price of wheat, which is 4 times 160. So this one, the current quantity, and you add it with the product of the price, the current price of corn, which is 2.50 times 220. So using your calculator, so we have here 4 times 160, that is 640, plus, no? Plus 2.5 times 220. So we have here 550. So 550 plus 640. So you have here 1,100, 1,190. Okay. So let's check again. So 4 times 160 plus 2.5 times 220, that is 1,190. So this is now your nominal GDP. Now, we're going to compute with the real GDP. So in real GDP, again, you will be using the price of the base year. And our base year, again, here is 2015. So we will be using the price of wheat in 2015, which is 3 euros, and the price of corn in 2015, which is 2 euros. So here, in 2015, so let's compute the real GDP. So we have here 3 times 150 plus 2 times 200. So here our real GDP is 850. Notice that if we use the base year, the nominal GDP and the real GDP are equal. And that is always true if we are going to use, if we're going to consider the base year. So for example, 2015 is our base year. So normally our nominal GDP is equivalent to the real GDP. Another in 2016, so we have here 3 times the current quantity, which is 140, plus 2 times 210. So if we're going to use our calculator here, 3 times 140, that is 420, plus 2 times 210. So if you sum it up, your real GDP is actually 840. Okay? So next, in 2017, so we have here 3 times 160 plus 2 times 220. So here 3 times 160 plus 2 times 220. So we have here 920. So we already have the real GDP. So if you notice here, the price of the product for wheat, so we use 3 because we use the price of the base year, which is 2015, and even the price of corn here, which is 2, is equal across year if we consider the real GDP, because again the price of corn, which is 2 euro, is the price of the base year. So since you already have the value of your nominal GDP and the real GDP, let's now compute the GDP, of course, GDP deflator. So we have here the GDP deflator. So in computing GDP deflator, you simply divide nominal GDP by the real GDP. So in 2015, so we have here, so I'm going to fix this one. So in 2015, our GDP deflator is 850 divided by 850 times 100. So we have here 100. while in 2016, our GDP deflator is 962.5 divided by 840. 962.5 divided by 840 times 100. That is 114.6. So, or 114.58. While in 2017, so we have here 1,190 divided by 920 times 100. So we have here 129.3. So this is now the the answer for your GDP deflator across years. So here we simply divide the nominal GDP by the real GDP in order to get the the GDP deflator. So I hope this is all clear. So since we already have the value for the GDP deflator for each year, we can now compute for the GDP deflator inflation rate. So in computing GDP deflator inflation rate, so you just simply get the difference of your GDP deflator this year minus the GDP deflator last year divided by the GDP deflator last year and times 100%. So if you're going to get the GDP deflator inflation rate for the period of 2015 to 2016, again, this is your this year, while this is your last year. So take note that our GDP deflator in 2016 is 114.6 minus 100. So divided by 100 times 100%. So we have here 14.6 percent. So that is our GDP inflation rate rather, for 2015 to 2016. However, for the GDP deflator inflation rate for 2016 to 2017, so now this time the 2017 is our current year, while the 2016 is our last year. So here our GDP deflator in 2017, so we have 129.3 minus 114.6, so that is the GDP deflator in 2016. So divided by 114.6 times 100%. So if you are going to compute the answer using your calculator, so the answer here is we have 12.8%. So this is our GDP deflator for GDP deflator inflation rate for the 2016 to 2017. So at some point, the values are close with the inflation rate using the CPI. So let's now proceed with the comparison using the CPI and the GDP deflator inflation rate. So take note that in 2016, we have here 2015, 2016, 2017. So we have here our CPI. So our CPI in 2015 is of course 100. And in 2016, we have here 114.7. And in 2017, we have 129.4. So if we're going to compute the inflation rate here, so on this case, 114.7 minus 100, so this is minus, divided by 100 times 100%, our inflation rate here is 14.7%. While on this, we have 129.4 minus 114.7, over 114.7 times 100%. So we have here 129.4 minus 114.7 divided by we have 14.7, right? Divided by 114.7. So we have here 12.8 percent. So on the other hand, in terms of the GDP deflator, so GDP deflator. So in 2015, so we have here 100, and in 2016 we have here 114.6, and in 2017 we have here 129.3. So the inflation rate, no, the inflation rate here. So I'm going to make this one clear. So here, inflation rate. So we have here 114.6 minus 100 divided by 100 times 100%. So we have here 14.6 percent. And here, so if we're going to compute 129.3 minus 114.6 divided by 114.6. So we have here 129.3 minus 114.6 divided by 114.6. So that is 12.82 or 12.8 percent. So they're actually similar. But on this case, we can really see that the CPI inflation rate is sometimes higher than the GDP deflator inflation rate. So it can be seen here that the CPI sometimes overestimates the inflation rate or even the cost of living. So if you can notice here, the CPI has higher values in comparison to the GDP deflator. So this is actually true that CPI overestimates the cost of living because of the problems. So these are the problems of um, of of CPI. First is what we call the substitution bias. So in the substitution bias, of course, we only consider the fixed basket, and we do not consider that given if there is an increase in the price or drastically increase in the price of this commodity in comparison to others, so we tend to find substitutes of that commodity. So considering the substitution bias, it overestimates, the CPI overestimates the cost of living. And another problem is the introduction of new goods. Since the CPI only accounts for the fixed basket, it doesn't consider with the goods that are newly introduced considering the current year. Unlike with the GDP deflator, it caters the introduction of new goods because it considers the current quantity, while in CPI it only focuses on the fixed basket. So sometimes CPI overestimates the cost of living because it cannot account the introduction of the new goods. And another is the unmeasured quality changes. So of course, it is really hard to measure the changes in terms of quality. Like what if the price of this good actually increases and so the quality, or sometimes even the price of this good did not increase, but the quality of this product actually decreases. So there are changes in terms of the quality that doesn't captured by the consumer price index. So that is why sometimes the CPI overestimates the cost of living. And of course, in order to address these problems, the Bureau of Labor Statistics or even the statistics authorities, they made adjustments in terms of the CPI and in computation of the inflation rate. So to address these problems. But despite of the problems of CPI, of course, it is still important because it measures the cost of living considering the consumer's typical basket. Unlike with the GDP deflator, it doesn't only accounts for the consumers, but even it accounts for the capital and other things. So on the next slide, we are going to compare and contrast the CPI and the GDP deflator as measures of the cost of living. So I hope that these are all clear. Okay, so now let's proceed with comparing CPI and GDP deflator. In terms of imported consumer goods, these are included in the CPI. So that is why, despite of the problems of CPI, it is still important because it covers all the consumption of the consumers, whether these goods are imported or made domestically. However, the imported consumer goods are excluded from the GDP deflator because, again, if we're going to go back with the definition of the GDP, it only accounts the goods produced domestically. So that is why the imports is actually deducted from exports. So that is why we consider net export in computing the GDP. So another in terms of capital goods. So when we say capital goods, these are the spending on goods that can be used for making business or even producing more goods and services. So it is not included in the CPI. So it is excluded from CPI because capital goods are not part of the basket of consumers. Of course, consumers will not be using this goods to produce goods or services because in the first place they only consume. Consumers are just consuming goods ready for final consumption, while it is included in the GDP deflator as long as it is produced, these goods are produced domestically. So if the capital goods like machines are made from other country, it is not part of the GDP deflator because it's not produced domestically. However, if the capital goods like the machines are made domestically, it's part of the GDP deflator. Because again, the GDP deflator is based on the GDP or the gross domestic product, which it accounts the consumption of goods and services, and even investment. So in investment, it refers to the spending on the capital goods. And these capital goods like machines, equipments, or buildings can be used in producing goods and services or even in making business. In terms of the basket, CPI uses fixed basket. So if you notice in our computation, the quantity is fixed across years. While in GDP deflator, it considers the currently produced goods and services. So that is why we use the current quantity. And this actually matters, especially if different prices are changing by different amounts. So that concludes my discussion about measuring cost of living using the CPI and GDP deflator. And I hope you learn on this video. So once again, a pleasant day to everyone.